Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so, how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name's Jenny Mills, and I'm the Secretary for Education and Learning in the United Reformed Church. Each week, I am joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. Today, I am very pleased to introduce the Revd Ash Barker. Ash is the founder and leader of Seedbeds. Seedbeds seeks to empower local communities to grow leaders and release potential in people, especially in urban settings. Ash and Angie Barker are currently planted in Winson Green, Birmingham, where they've been since 2014, having led pioneering projects in Australia and Thailand in the past. Ash is involved in many things that encourage people to learn and grow and thrive, and is particularly keen on pioneering and encouraging everyone to learn. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Ash today.
Well, thank you, Jenny. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you.
Oh, thanks. Well, thank you for joining us. So, Politics in the Pulpit, that's our title. Just give me your initial responses to how you hear that and how you see yourself as a politician in the pulpit, where you find yourself.
Yeah, well, politics to me is around power, and how do we ensure that we're empowered by God to do the things that God wants done. So power is about actioning things, and communities like where we are here in Winson Green often marginalized by the powers that be. And so for me, the pulpit is a place to empower people. And so the Bible is really important in this big story of empowering those on the edges and those who have been oppressed. It's about liberation for me. So wherever we've gone, whether it being a slum in Bangkok for 12 years or a refugee community in Melbourne for over 10 years, or here in inner city Birmingham, that is good news. The gospel is good news for the poor, for the oppressed, for those who are unable to see. That's So I won't get into preaching right now, but
we come to that bit in a bit when you get to run free through the texts in a minute. So hearing that about power and the communities in which you've worked, particularly with marginalized people, what do you see as the key political and justice issues that are facing the people alongside whom you journey at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the disparity between rich and poor is obscene. I say I lived in a slum community for 12 years, and I thought it was bad in Thailand. I really did. And I thought coming to the West, it would be a bit more equal. But the pandemic has shown that there are really two speeds. There are two economies going on, one for the mega wealthy and one for the rest. And certainly you feel that here. Most of the institutions that you would expect to work, whether it be education, health, just in the pandemic, they just collapsed. Housing, all these things have kind of collapsed. So housing's a big one for us because if you don't have secure housing, it's very hard. We've got a big prison actually here in Winson Green, one of the biggest in the UK. And if folks coming out don't have secure housing, if they don't have meaningful things to do, if they don't have relationships that are meaningful as well, one of those, if you miss out on one of those things, you're in trouble. And that's true for our neighborhood as a whole. So there are three big ones, I'd say: meaningful work, things to do, secure housing, and meaningful connections, relationship with other people.
Okay. Well, with these concerns and issues in mind, each week my JPIC colleagues put together some of the things that we want to keep an eye on around the world. So I'm just going to run through those. It feels at the moment that there's an awful lot that is making us anxious, and a lot that is troubling us, and particularly as you talk about this disparity in the world. But the latest inflation figures show price rises soaring towards 10%. The government is facing increasing pressure, and I think it's that it's hitting everybody, isn't it? The rising prices. Concern is growing about the war with Ukraine and Russia, and the rising impact on global food supplies. Some of those issues, but alongside that, a lot of this displaced people's stuff. So the effects of war around the world. There are nearly 60 million people were internally displaced by conflict and natural disasters in 2021, which is, can't even get your head around it. And then Wednesday, the 25th of May, is the second anniversary of the death of George Floyd. And churches together in England are encouraging us to light a candle of justice. This sense that there is natural and conflict issues, but equally there are these local community conflict issues around race, gender and sexuality as well. The Met Police have concluded their investigation into the parties in Downing Street, and hopefully we'll have the Sue Gray report that ties in with all of this kind of disparity between people. And then we've got the issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol that was agreed and not agreed, and all the political stuff that goes around that, and probably best not to get started on. And then finally, the Rwanda asylum seekers within the month. Now, what I did hear on the news this morning is that because there are some legal challenges, this may not happen as soon as we think, which is when we hear things like there are legal challenges, I think that gives us a bit of hope, doesn't it? We're also in the church season, we're just drawing to the end of Easter. So we'll have had Ascension on the 26th of May this year, and so we are moving on towards Pentecost. So we've put ourselves in a church year, we've put ourselves in a political climate, we've put ourselves in a context that you are working in. So over to you with that in our mind and our Bible in our other hand. Please take us where you want to take us with the text that we've got.
Yes. So I think these texts are really interesting given the place we're in. And I must say, I'm a little bit, I've just come off a Zoom call to Burma in Myanmar with internally displaced people there. There's a war zone kind of going on between the military dictatorship. Yeah. And reading these texts literally kind of while I'm waiting for things to happen there, it's hard not to see what's going on in the world in these texts, not least the Acts passage where you see a young slave girl. This is Acts 16 to 34. I think for me the theme is around hope, and it is around what real salvation is, because so often those things are glib, kind of things for people of faith even. So in Myanmar, for example, at the moment, there's a civil war kind of going on. And these young activists, 50 of them this morning, we were on the Zoom too. The temptation for them is these multinational companies that are doing sweatshops, they're using slave labor. And so what we've been trying to do is generate healthy work. Because in this text, you see there's unhealthy work, there's unjust work, there's slavery of a young woman who's being abused, who's being used to generate wealth for other people. And you see Paul and willing to stand up against those powers. But of course, it frees this young woman. I love that the new Revised Standard Version is getting an update. You probably know that it's just come out. I've got it on Kindle version. It's coming out in print version. But rather than calling her a slave girl, it's a female slave. Now, that may not mean a lot to a whole lot of people, but actually describing a person first, rather than what's happening to them in oppressive terms, is really in important language today. And I love that this new NRSV version kind of picks that kind of language up. Now, it's interesting that she notices in Paul this authority for change, that salvation isn't just about getting to heaven when you die. Salvation is about the healing of all things through Jesus. And so she recognizes that even though she's abused and used in so many ways, she speaks out and actually, it's the text is, it annoys the apostles. They get annoyed.
Absolutely, yeah.
But she persists and keeps going. She's seeing it, and she's not going to let them get away with walking by. And so she just keeps at it. And I don't know if you've experienced that when people start to become liberated, it just all comes out, and you can't stop it. And I love it when people feel free enough to kind of say what they really mean. They're no longer inhibited, and so she becomes free. The apostles are part of that, but of course, there's a kickback. And whenever you displace power, whenever those at the top feel like they're missing out, they bite back, and they bite back viciously here. And so the sense here, I think, is there is hope, there is salvation, but it's costly salvation. It's costly to offer it, costly to be involved in solidarity. Liberation is not cheap, even if it is freeing people. And so I see that this text, you think around the world, and Myanmar particularly, my thoughts are today, the temptation into slavery to try and get some money quickly so you can get it back to your family. There's 150,000 members of the civil disobedience movement, and that's the movement we've been linking with. And they're not allowed to work. The military are stopping them working. And these are brilliant people. These are civil servants. These are others. And so the temptation for oppressive regime to abuse, but also then capitalists kind of people looking to exploit people. So the internal displacement happens, but also people fleeing across the border. And where I lived in Bangkok, in Thailand, the sex industry was just awful. It just exploited incredibly young people and destroyed their futures really quickly. And but then the sweatshops were there as well, and even trying to this is how sneaky these corporations can be. The big corporations you're talking about, these are not just little mom and pop operations, although they can be sometimes. The government in Thailand raised the minimum price of wage per hour, and it went, it was, I think it ended up being like $5 a day. And in Thailand, it's really hard to live on $5 a day. So what did the big sweatshop companies do? They just moved their operations to Bangladesh. And so 10,000 laborers were suddenly out of work. And so it's a really difficult, challenging thing and it can feel like there's no hope, actually. It can feel like you get put in a prison of kinds. And of course, Paul and it's Silas, isn't it? Get literally put in a prison for standing up for this woman and freeing her and displacing the powers that be. And so, but of course.
And do you think when what I think interesting when the girl was no longer possessed by the spirit, and so they lost the income, and actually the owners of her didn't even raise that as an issue. They said these men are making trouble, and so they didn't even take that responsibility, did they? They kind of gave us an alternative story, and I think we're seeing a lot of that.
Yes. Yeah, the not taking responsibility is a huge political thing here in the UK, isn't it? Who's responsible for this rise in prices? Nobody personally, is it? It's always someone else's fault. It's always these invisible global hands that are kind of moving things. The same ones, of course, that our governments are saying we need to be part of to be able to thrive economically. The other connection we've had, of course, has been with the Ukraine. We run a master's program with the Ukrainian Theological Seminary, and this week our partners and colleagues there have been doing amazing work. Their seminary has been bombed by Russia, but they're bravely kind of standing up and fixing up their seminary. It's a central place for aid and support for people, but it's wave after wave, though, of grief and disappointment and hurt, and hearing of some of our students who have been killed on the front line, being chaplains, looking after some of the army folks resisting, is so full on. And again, just because you do the right thing doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean you get a good ride from that. And this text is very honest about that. You know, it's saying, actually, you stand up, you could end up in prison yourself.
Yeah.
One of the experiences I had in Australia was with asylum seekers in Australia, and the National Council of Churches in Australia had a very good relationship with the Timorese asylum seekers. There were 1,650 Timorese who were facing deportation back to occupied Timor at that time. This is in the 90s, and we were part of a movement called the Sanctuary Network movement that would hide the Timorese in our homes rather than have them deported back to occupied Timor. And of course, the government comes out and say, if anyone does that, it's a 6-month jail sentence. I was part of an organizing group, and for some people that was a bit scary. You know, what happens if we get put in prison?
Yeah.
But like all community organizers, when you stand together, and we had over 20,000 people sign up for it, including unions and nuns and
Wow.
that all church people. I would say I was on the organising committee. The truth is, I let this happen out now, but at the time you have 20,000 people willing to do it, and not enough jails. And are you really going to put nuns and ministers and trade union people in prison, and including old diggers? Diggers are people who were in the army in Australia, and some of them actually were hidden by Timorese people in their homes when the Japanese invasion was happening, and Australian soldiers were hidden by Timorese, and now Australian soldiers are willing to hide Timorese in their homes. It was an amazing kind of story, but the government said 6 months jail. Interestingly enough, more people signed up, and after 10 years of that campaign, the government didn't deport them, and in fact all of them got permanent residency.
Wow.
But it was that sticking together, and I think the last passage in John about unity, of being willing to be in solidarity with each other, of standing with each other, of not letting the cracks and let people play off each other. That unity theme is a really important piece, I think, of being one in Jesus, one in Christ, one in seeking justice together. And actually those dark powers can be resisted and engaged and defeated.
In the Acts text, with just exactly with what you're saying, it ties in, is that in verse 26 it says all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were off. I was thinking that I was reading somewhere about liberation is communal. You know, that sense of what you're doing and what you're engaging with, that liberation and that hope actually is not just for me. And I think sometimes we've done personal salvation stuff so much we've forgotten this liberation for community.
Yes, and even at the end, it's the salvation is the whole household. Now, households weren't individual mum and dad and a kid. Households in those days were huge, kind of mini neighborhoods often, and so that all of them come together, and all of them are able to see change and liberation as well is important for the jailer. But you're right, those in prison are all liberated. And again, this is part of taking up Jesus' agenda. I'd say one quick thing about prisons, because prisons, you probably know, in the UK is having a disastrous time. With COVID, they essentially just locked prisoners in their cells for 23 and a half hours a day. That happened here in our prison here had riots here a few years ago with a private company that was running it, and now the government have taken it back. But basically, basic things like chapel, like visits, all those things have been minimalized, and here in Winson Green they haven't started up again even now. And it's a massive prison reform is a big deal that needs a lot of attention. It's not attention that people want to give to it, because people think, oh, prisoners, they all deserve to be where they are. But actually there's a Victorian era prison where they had two young men in a cell together for 23 and a half hours a day. They only had half an hour to get their food in there. They had half an hour out. And so if you didn't have a mental health or addiction problem when you went in, you would soon have one. Anybody would. And so that's happening right here in this neighborhood right today.
Yeah.
And so prison reform and being liberating prisoners and finding new ways to do things. I'm really impressed by Steve Chalk and what he's trying to do and reimagining youth detention, trying to make them into schools and places to help people rather than bang them up and try and hide them away. That doesn't work. There's reasons why people have ended up in these places, and that they're the issues that need to be addressed.
Yes, and that's exactly so. That the common thread that's come out in the podcast that I've been doing is this sense of we need to be going to the root cause of the problems. We're just sticking plasters all the time, and I think in relation to prison and we've got the fear of the jailer here, who's frightened of the Roman occupation, and he's frightened for himself. And I think with the prisons, there's this terrible situation for those that are working in the prisons as well as the prisoners, because it's an awful place for all of them. Nobody is being enabled in this at all, are they?
Yes, that's exactly right. And the poor staff, who are often G4S got rid of all their experienced workers because they were too expensive, and so they brought in young people with really short. So these people are often scared of what's going on. Of course, the riot happened here when actually an experienced worker was over. There was only one officer on the wing. He got overwhelmed by prisoners. They took his keys off him and then went through, opened up lots of the doors. And that was the riot. And so you feel for those officers. Honestly, how I feel for teachers as well, actually, because I feel like the authorities and how they're evaluating what people are doing is oppressive as well. It's schools that aren't quite prisons, but actually they can feel like it for both the students and the teachers, and the kind of authorities that the kind of fear Ofsted can put into teachers is like the jailer kind of being scared of what's going to happen to him if people are liberated, if people are free to grow and be, and so I see lots of these authorities, institutional powers are not about liberation. They're not about freedom and growth for people.
No.
They're about control and disempowering people. And how do we get outcomes that the state wants, not necessarily what people need?
Yeah. And I think that's where the John text kind of speaks this amazing. It's amazing. Well, it's the farewell discourse, isn't it? But it's about love. It's about, and that really Jesus addresses God as Father there, but has real great caring, compassionate, that whole, I think we've got some issues in society as well with this demarcation of male and female, and boys don't cry and girls do, and I think this text really opens up the attributes of Christ that actually we are to embody, isn't it? It's not about being powerful. It's about being compassionate and kind and loving and doing that alongside each other. And it's in those settings that we have unity, but we also have an incredible amount of power.
Yes, and it's interesting that the word power is an interesting one. I for years never liked the idea of power. I didn't want to have power. I wanted to be a servant, and so didn't take power seriously enough. But because there are different kinds of power, there is a kind of authority that empowers other people and liberates people. But there is also power above that kind of domesticates and oppresses people. And this kind of power in unity is when one hurts, all hurt. I mean, the George Floyd anniversary is really important. We'll be lighting a candle at Lodge Road URC on Wednesday. We're getting a whole group of us because we have a large Black community here. And Afro-Caribbean kind of folks mainly, but also from Africa and other refugee places from within Africa. And then we do have a lot of asylum seekers, actually, who are people of color. And the fear of going to Rwanda is very real. I was speaking with one of our workers yesterday who works mainly with asylum seekers and trying to help them with their cases. And people are scared. People are scared they're going to be rounded up because they've come from traumatic backgrounds where the police and powers round people up and stick them in prison. And so of course they're fearful when they hear that we're going to be sent to Rwanda. And nothing, no contacts or no, or nothing there. They'll be forgotten and not any responsibility. And that, unfortunately, this is a model that Australia went down with Manus Island and other places, and the abuses that happened in those places were horrendous. And that the UK would go down that route is just unbelievable. And I'm glad that there's challenges to that. But lining the can for on Wednesday is really important for us because we're saying together we won't put up with it. That any kind of racism is unfair, and God stands against it, and we stand with God in this.
And have you seen? I've seen two. I think one was earlier on this year, and one was recently in Glasgow and Edinburgh, where they were trying to deport people, and the whole community. And I was watching it on Twitter once, and it was like, "Come down to here now," because they're trying to take some. And suddenly, virally, all of these people, and it just kind of embodies this text, doesn't it? There was this sudden gathering of people from all over Edinburgh, all over Glasgow, and in the end, they didn't take the people away. And I just think that just fills me with, because there are times when I feel a bit hopeless at the moment, because what can I do to make a difference?
Yeah.
And I think that just embodied this for me.
Yes. And the other two texts are about hope as well, aren't they? They're what will happen in the end, that there will be a God. Interesting, actually, that righteousness and justice in Psalm 97, that the Hebrew there is mishpakus tzedakah, which is about, it isn't just about justice, it is about, but it's a social justice. It's a justice for all. It's the right relationships of God, people, and place being in harmony together. And that's the kind of God we have. And of course, right at the end of time in Revelation, that is fully kind of flows like that for everybody. And that's what we dream for. That's what we're living for. We want to be on that side. We don't want to be against that vision of hope coming true. The hope of salvation is that everyone is healed through Jesus. Every place is healed through Jesus. And we can be part of that now. We've got to be on the right side of that eschatology. And there is a kind of confronting kind of language at Revelation, isn't it? I'm coming soon. My reward is with me to repay according to everyone's work. Now, for Reform folk, it's grace, it's not works. But actually, there is a kind of fruit of our lives that this is talking about. What did our life really mean? What kind of work was worthwhile at the end of our lives? And I think standing with those who are oppressed, standing with those who need empowerment, that's the reward. It's costly, as Paul and Silas found out, but the costs are worth it. The costs are worth it, because in the end, all things will be reconciled through Christ, and that day is a great day, one worth giving our lives for.
Yeah, I mean, it's just wondrous. And I think the more we journey through Revelation, the more we realize those texts are actually speaking to us so much today, aren't they? This sense they were speaking to a marginalized people. They were speaking to people who were struggling against the Roman authorities, the empire, and kind of, stand up against this allegiance to Rome. And it's how do we as followers of Jesus actually embody that? And it isn't about let's go out and do nice things to those poor people out there, is it? Because I think for a long time, churches have seen that they've had the answer and they're giving it to people. And actually what we're doing is we're embodying it. We're meeting people where they are. And I think one of the things I know that you do is you encourage people to identify their own gifts and talents, and then you kind of and then you encourage them. I mean, I don't know, that seems to me that's exactly what the Revelation and actually the Psalm as well is talking about, encouraging others to do, to use their God-given gifts.
Yes, that's right. It's about flourishing, and when everybody flourishes, that's the kingdom of God at work. But when part of our body is not flourishing, there's attention that needs to be given. Here in Winson Green, it was a nuts day yesterday. It was when we picked up really and tried to replant a congregation in United Reformed Church Lodge Road, or Lodge Road Community Church as we call it now. It was a really old, derelict Victorian era prison, not prison, chapel, and it really was falling down around our ears. But the community got together, and part of the vision was this can be a base to use our gifts and talents and assets and help our neighborhood together. What could we do? And the musicians came out of the woodwork, and artists came out of the woodwork. And everyone can do something. One of our old guys, Steve, says, I can't do very much, but I'm good at Airfix models, little aeroplanes, putting them together. Yeah. So we've got a table for you, Steve, here. And he was there yesterday with a whole group of some young, some old, all making little aeroplanes together, meaningful things to do together that were really powerful. Older folk were dancing. There was one of our guys singing, and they were dancing together. I mean, I think that's a taste of the kingdom of God. That's what's going to happen. Everybody's needed. Everybody's gifts and talents are valued. And that's the hope of salvation, that everybody is healed and able to join in.
I think you picked up that unity is a common theme, and I also think I noted that it's the power of God's love to transform lives, and it's for me, salvation has become quite in many traditional church settings, we have salvation as quite a narrow thing, but actually to me salvation is transformation, isn't it?
It is, and matters. It's not just about individual souls. If that was the case, we wouldn't need the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus could have zapped people from heaven, couldn't he? He'd have to incarnate into the world and rise again in bodily form. That's what we believe, that it's a new body, but it's matters. And so I'm really disturbed actually by a lot of folks saying, well, justice doesn't really matter. All these other things, what really matters is individual souls. And I've had that conversation with key Christian leaders around this country actually, and really disturbed, because that's not the Christian view of the world. The Christian view of the world is that God is present here and he's incarnating his love and life and vitality. And when we destroy that, we're destroying God. And so we need to get on board with what God's doing and not try and isolate souls from bodies. When there's an old Brazilian saying that when we try and take a soul from the body, we're left with a corpse, and when we try and take a body from the soul, we're left with a ghost. But what we have in Christ is a resurrection, the incarnating God who suffers with us, but who rises again. And this great text at the end is coming soon, coming again to put all things right. And that great day is a day worth hanging on for and doing all that we can, no matter the cost.
Ash, thank you so much. I have this feeling that you and I could sit here for quite a lot longer, but I'm afraid we have a time limit. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom and your reflections and your theology with us, and for connecting so closely the world in which we live and the texts that we have for this week. To those listening or watching, we hope that you have enjoyed this, and please leave us a review wherever you listen to the podcast and share it with your friends. We know that our listeners are a passionate and knowledgeable crowd, and so the best way, please join in the conversations. If there's questions, if there's comments, join in on Twitter at @pulpit_politics. I usually don't manage to get that out actually, or hashtag politics in the pulpit. Or on our Facebook community, you can join through the Joint Public Issues team, Joint Public Issues Facebook page. Each week I try to have a question, and I've kind of picked up the reading from Acts about when faced with biblical texts, we often identify the righteous and the holy, and then we have the outcast. And maybe sometimes we see ourselves often in the role of the righteous. And my question is it all, how do we identify ourselves? Are we the outcast sometimes? Are we the sinner sometimes rather than the righteous? And I think that sense of a judgment of others. So how do we relate ourselves to the texts that we read? Let us know your thoughts on this. If you've been listening for a while, you know that JPIT have their 2022 conference From the Ground Up, Unearthing Hope and Seeking Justice on the 11th of June. This will be online and in London at Oasis Waterloo. We have a special discount for podcast listeners. Woohoo! By going to jointpublicissues.org.uk/conference, use the code podcast10. You can get 10% off your ticket, and under 25s and those on low incomes go free. A reminder of the code podcast10. So we go into our politics and our pulpits with a blessing. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. And may God bless us in this endeavour. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks ever so much, Ash. Take care. Go safely.
Thank
Bye.
you.